Thanks very much, Tom. Firstly, I'd like to recommend the exhibition to you all, not just because I curated it. As you all know, it's called Beyond Burma, and it takes the story up beyond, because it takes the story up to the independence of Burma in 1948, as well as the ragged war, end of the war against the Japanese, which David mentioned earlier. In fact, I'm going to sort of repeat myself throughout this talk. Like David mentioned, that will be a few times, and also Beyond Burma we mentioned a few times. So the British and Indian soldiers are still actually fighting against the nationalist forces in French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, and the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, right up until 1946. Beyond Burma, because of the geographical nature, so the exhibition covers Malaya, Burma, and Northeast India as well. And India. And the subtitle is Forgotten Armies, perhaps an overused word, forgotten. 14th Army called the Forgotten Army, the Burma Campaign, the Forgotten War. But what I think is really forgotten is the large number of African and Indian soldiers who are fighting in the theatre, and David mentioned this earlier. So even early on in 14th Army, there are 340,000 Indian soldiers, 100,000 British, and 80,000 African. And by 1945, it's overwhelmingly Indian Army. And the exhibition tells the stories of these African, British, Burmese, and Indian service personnel. And another main theme is jungle warfare, because I think the jungle is an alien environment for pretty much anyone who's fighting in it. So I'm going to talk about a book I co-authored with my good friend Raymond Callahan, who David mentioned earlier, Professor Emeritus at the University of Delaware. He wrote one of the first books on the Burma campaign in 1978. And he actually corresponded with Reginald Savory, who's one of the generals I'm going to talk about. More recently, Ray and Dan Marsden won the Templar Medal Prize for their joint book, The 1945 Burma Campaign and the Transformation of the British Indian Army, published in 2020, and I wholeheartedly recommend it to you all. So the three generals in the book are Claude Auchinleck, the Auk, William Slim, Bill Slim, and Reginald Savory, Reg Savory. And he's perhaps the one you haven't heard about. All three served in the Indian Army, a distinctive army, very distinctive, that we've heard about from David. The Auk and Bill Slim became field marshals, with Auchinleck retiring as commander-in-chief in 1947. Bill Slim was the only Indian Army general to become chief of the Imperial General Staff after the Second World War. And Reginald Savory retired as Adjutant General of the Indian Army in 1947. And I'm going to start with the Gallipoli campaign, where both Slim and Savory served. So the campaign was the brainchild of the future Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, after the stalemate of the Western Front. An Anglo-French force landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula and the surrounding area to try and defeat the Turkish forces that were allied with Germany. The legacy of Gallipoli has become a huge part of the national identity of Turkey, as well as Australia and New Zealand. But for the Indian Army, Expeditionary Force G went to Gallipoli. It was about 16,000 soldiers, out of a total of almost 470,000 men of the British and Empire forces. 29th Brigade was an all-Indian brigade, which is quite interesting, such an early stage of the First World War. So the 3 Gurkha regiments and the 14th Sikhs, which is quite unusual at this early stage. This is much more common in 1943 to 45 in Burma, as David mentioned earlier. So the 14th Sikhs, the main action for the 14th Sikhs was the attack on Gully Ravine. And you can see a picture here of Gully Ravine. The attack was on the 4th of June 1915 during the Third Battle of Krithia, and the regiment was decimated. Reginald Savory was a junior officer in the regiment and was hit in the head in the attack. And he was picked up by Sepoy Uda Singh, one of the regimental wrestlers, and taken to the field ambulance. And later on in his career, even when he's Adjutant General in 1946-47. He gives, he lets his secretary know that if an Indian officer comes in, doesn't matter what meeting he's in, let him straight through. He keeps in touch with Uda Singh after retirement. And we've got Reginald Savory's papers downstairs. They're extensive and they're excellent. And in his diaries, he says, saw Uda Singh last night, gave him a good feed. So at the end of the battle, only the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Palin, and the battalion's medical officer, Lieutenant Heraji Kurtsaji, and 47 Sikhs remained. A little bit about Heraji Kurtsaji. He's a very interesting character. He was a commissioned officer in the First World War. The only Indian commissioned officers in the First World War are medical officers. And his medal group is on display upstairs in the Global Gallery. And he actually becomes the first Indian to become a Major General in 1943 during the Second World War. So Savory himself was reported dead, with a telegram sent to his parents, officially reporting his death. Although 7 days later, another telegram reported him wounded, and I quote, very much regretted the error. He went on to serve at Savory Bay, and Savory commented on the lessons learned at Gallipoli and Savory Bay, in particular stating, and I quote again, "By God, if we had one World War II brigadier in Savory Bay, we would have got Gallipoli without the slightest trouble at all." The implication being that senior officers were much more tactically aware and better trained during the later war. And I think this is perhaps epitomised by the careers of these three generals. Slim also served in Gallipoli with the 9th Battalion Royal Warwickshire Regiment. And in 15 days, the battalion had lost 4 officers and 510 other ranks killed or wounded. On the night of the 7th, 8th of August, Slim's much diminished company made contact with Major Cecil Allinson and the 1st 6th Gurkha Rifles to jointly attack the summit of Hill Q on the following morning. Whilst positioning his men for the attack, Slim was shot through the lung, with a bullet smashing his shoulder. He was evacuated and returned to Britain in a hospital ship, fully expected by the attending doctor to die on the way home. On arrival, a doctor suggested surgery that would have ended his military career, but another doctor advised him to refuse surgery and opt for newer treatment methods. As a result, he regained the use of his shoulder and arm and unbelievably passed an Army Medical Board as permanently disabled but fit to return to active service. Auchinleck, Slim and Savory all served in the main First World War theatre for the Indian Army, which is Mesopotamia. And there Bill Slim was actually injured again. And he recovered in Simla. And he was now in the West India Regiment with a permanent commission and attached to Army headquarters as a staff officer in the Directorate of Military Operations. I think due to this, his service at Army headquarters and also the patronage of the Commander-in-Chief India, General Charles Monro, he transferred to the 1st Battalion, 6th Gurkha Rifles, who'd been at Gallipoli after the First World War. And I think it's worth stating here that Monro is quite an interesting character in himself. He's transferred from Western Front. He's responsible for the evacuation of Gallipoli. And he brought with him a number of British Army officers that transform Army headquarters from 1916 to 1918. And I mention this because this is similarly what happens in 1943 in what's called GHQ India at the time. But this time it's not British service officers, it's Indian Army officers, and namely people like Auchinleck, Slim and Savory. Auchinleck was slightly older than the other two. He was a pre-war regular. And after the First World War, the next 20 years for him were a slow and steady climb up the Indian Army professional ladder. He attended the Indian Army Staff College at Quetta, spent a year at the Imperial Defence College, and he returned to India to move smoothly through a series of command and staff appointments, as well as command of a major punitive expedition against the Moman tribe on the northwest frontier. And by 1938, he was Deputy Chief of the General Staff at Army Headquarters in Delhi, and clearly earmarked for higher command. And the Indian Army was at this point already in the throes of a major personnel change called Indianization, which David talked about earlier. which was awarding King's Commissions to Indians, thus giving them equal status with British officers as a result of the important role of the Indian Army during the First World War. So implementation of this Indianization was a very slow and halting process. There was outright opposition on the grounds that Indian officers could not show the leadership qualities that the British officers did. There were also concerns about British officers coming under Indian command. These concerns, some clearly racial, however, were overborne by the clear political necessity for the commissioning of Indians to march in step with political change. An unsatisfactory compromise was therefore reached. 8 units were chosen to be Indianized, and once Indian commissioned officers were posted to them, no more British officers would be. Thus, their officers would slowly become completely Indian from the bottom up, and no British officer would have to serve under an Indian officer. But once again, change was inevitable, and after an experiment with sending Indian cadets to Sandhurst in the 20s, an Indian military academy was opened in 1932 at Dehradun. Auchinleck disliked the 8-unit scheme and felt British and Indian officers should meet socially as well as serve together professionally. But he did not have the power to turn his view into policy yet. So Savory was one of the first officers to instruct at the Indian Military Academy. And he thought it was one of the most important jobs of his career. And he wrote in his diary in early January 1932, and I quote, "I must now think about my attitude towards Indianization. It has always been liberal, rather than otherwise, and my time as an instructor at Belgaum taught me there is little that the Indian cannot be taught to do well." Earlier in the 20s, he'd actually been teaching at the Indian Army School of Education. Indeed, when interviewed in 1974, Savory considered the Indianization process of the 20s, and I quote again, had not really been sincerely applied, and was approaching Indianization in a dishonest way, with command of the Indianized units given to British officers who were clearly not really up to the job. The Indian Military Academy was the first permanent officer training academy in India and continues to function today. He taught there for a couple of years, and some cadets, such as the future Lieutenant General Harbach Singh, were inspired by Savory. And he wrote in his memoir, In the Line of Duty, A Soldier's Remembers, and I quote, "I remember an incident in our military history class being taken by Captain Savory, an officer of high caliber whom I greatly admired. He was always upright and perfectly dressed, both in uniform and civil dress. And I must admit that it was due to him that I put in for the 5th Battalion of the Sikh Regiment, as he'd belonged to the 1st Battalion of the Sikh Regiment. The incident I'm about to relate illustrates his many qualities. When Captain Savory noticed that a few heads in the last 2 rows of the class were nodding away, he quietly sent for the Gurkha bugler on duty and asked him to stand at the rear of the class and play it. The poor cadets who were nodding off woke up to a start while the rest of us had a good laugh. What a way to teach a lesson. But then Captain Savory was an exceptional man. And Savory actually encouraged these cadets all the way throughout his career. And I think it's a real turning point, 1932. So the first officer cadets there, they're called the Pioneers. So Sam Manekshaw, he becomes Chief of the Army Staff of the Indian Army. General Mohammed Musa becomes Chief of the Staff of the Pakistan Army in the 50s. And General Smith Dunn is the first Commander-in-Chief of the Burma Army immediately after independence in 1948. And to come back to the exhibition, Smith Dunn's medal group is actually on display upstairs. So one of the cadets actually joined Savory's regiment, and when Savory put him up for his club, and I quote from his correspondence, they turned him down. "I put the club out of bounds to all my officers from that minute. Eventually the penny dropped and this man was allowed to become a member of the club." He considered his time at the Indian Military Academy, and I quote again, as one of the few achievements of my Indian Army career that I'm proud, and saw as a watershed in my military career and my political thinking so far as India was concerned. As he noted in later life, British Indian Army officers only really knew the soldiers and the servants in India. And this was the first time Savory came across the middle class of India, who he found to be very outspoken and highly intelligent. With the onset of the Second World War, Auchinleck was involved in Norwegian campaign. He commanded a corps in Britain and then became Commander-in-Chief Middle East, replacing General Wavell after the success of Rommel and the Africa Corps against the numerically superior British and Commonwealth troops in North Africa. Auchinleck planned for Operation Crusader, the British Army's first major offensive against the German army. The Western Desert Force had now grown into 2 corps and was therefore rechristened 8th Army. And he chose Lieutenant General Alan Cunningham as the new army commander. Cunningham had recently led the successful campaign against Mussolini's East African, the Italian forces in East Africa. Crusader began on the 18th of November 1941 to high hopes, especially on Prime Minister Winston Churchill's part. 8th Army fielded more armour than its opponent, and Cunningham's plan, however, was seriously flawed, with the armour and the infantry largely operating separately, rather than in all-arms cooperation. And on the evening of the 23rd of November 1941, in Cunningham's command caravan, Auchinleck listened to an obviously exhausted Cunningham describe the Army's tanks losses and the concern of the defence of Egypt to be endangered if the 8th Army was destroyed. Auchinleck quickly made one of the most important careers of his decision. Almost by default, he looked at his staff in Cairo and settled on his Deputy Chief of Staff, a relatively junior Major General Neil Ritchie, as the new 8th Army commander. It was a fateful choice. Ritchie was in fact junior to both corps commanders, and although a very good staff officer, had never actually commanded a large formation in action. Perhaps that mattered less in Auchinleck's calculation, since he planned to spend much more time at 8th Army headquarters to monitor the situation. In the short term, it worked. British leadership was suddenly much firmer, even if at the tactical level, British armour was no more deftly handled. By the end of 1941, 8th Army was back at the point where the original 1940 offensive had ended nearly a year before. Auchinleck had won the first British battlefield victory of the war over the German army, but in deciding to leave Ritchie in command of 8th Army, he inadvertently sowed the seeds of the problem that would end his career as a theatre commander. Just as Rommel's January 1942 counterattack had in many ways replicated what he had done in March 41, the decisive opening days of his offensive replayed the opening of Crusader, when the British armour had been allowed to disperse its efforts and had never successfully reunited. In the opening days of the Gazala battle, the speed and ferocity of Rommel's drive into the rear of the 8th Army knocked its armoured units off balance. There followed nearly 3 weeks of very confused fighting, in which 8th Army, superior to Rommel's army in so many categories, but not in command structure, was defeated in detail. Lieutenant General Sir Francis Tucker, Tucker actually commanded 4th Indian Division, North Africa. He's another Indian Army general who I think he's very innovative from the 1930s onwards. He's director of military training in India at the beginning of the war, and he's allowed to put all his ideas of training into process when he commands 4th Indian Division, North Africa. I think he's very successful. He never gets goes higher to corps level in 8th Army, but I always wonder, he's quite an abrasive character, so maybe that's one of the reasons. But he does become a corps commander in Burma. Tucker called it the worst managed battle in British military history. At dawn on the 20th of June, the F Corps broke into Tobruk. The next morning, Tobruk surrendered with 33,000 men, and Churchill wrote, "Defeat is one thing, disgrace is another." At the same time, however, there was taking place in the desert an event that would salvage the situation. So realising the battle had escaped Ritchie's control, Auchinleck flew up from Cairo and took command of the 8th Army. He told a staff officer accompanying him, and I quote, "The British pride themselves on being good losers. I'm a damn bad loser. I'm going to win." The ensuing month saw Auchinleck do just that. He halted Rommel's headlong drive toward Cairo and the Suez Canal and laid the foundation for what Montgomery was able to do at the end of August, defeating Rommel's last offensive in the Battle of Alam Halfa. The crucial moment came on the 1st of July, The last of the 8th Army had barely reached the Alamein position when the Alpha Corps attacked it, but were finally brought to a halt at the First Battle of Alamein. On the 31st of July, Auchinleck told Churchill that he'd need at least 6 weeks before the 8th Army could resume the offensive. And this marked the end for Auchinleck. He was sacked by Churchill in the Cairo Purge and flew back to India and was unemployed for a few months. He was perhaps rightly criticised for his choice of army commanders, but as an Indian Army general, he knew far fewer of his British Army colleagues, and similarly, those officers that he brought from India, such as Tom Gorbett and Dorman Smith, were not highly regarded and also went in the Cairo Purge. So I'll now talk about the campaign in Southeast Asia. So from December 1941 to May 1942, the British Empire forces suffered the most humiliating series of defeats in its history, as Hong Kong, Malaya, Borneo, Singapore, and Burma fell in rapid succession to the Imperial Japanese Army. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 was considered by Winston Churchill as the worst and the largest capitulation in history. The Japanese had overrun the numerically superior Commonwealth forces in Malaya in just over 2 months. However, 2 years later, the Imperial Japanese Army suffered at the hands of the 14th Army in the battles of the Second Arakan, Imphal, and Kohima, and the later battles for Burma. And the transformation in the fortunes of these troops, and the Indian Army in particular, was in a large part due to the development of doctrine, the resulting improvement in training, tactics, logistics, equipment, and most importantly for this talk, leadership from the top, and all the way down to junior leadership on the front line. The retreat from Burma was the longest retreat in British military history, and the Japanese forces invaded in January 42 to protect their advances across Southeast Asia and prevent American supplies getting through to China, as mentioned earlier today. However, the rapid expansion of the Indian Army and the Burmese forces, such as the Burma Rifles, for example, meant that the defending forces were undertrained and under-equipped to fight effectively against the battle-hardened Imperial Japanese Army. So I think the Japanese Army was battle-hardened because it had been fighting in China, not necessarily jungle-trained. Some jungle warfare training had gone on in the Japanese Army, but not that much. So it was just because they were battle-hardened. Due to the lack of equipment and personnel, the original plan was pared down. Oh, sorry, I'm just, sorry, yeah. So after the retreat from Burma, the next Allied offensive, and this was mentioned by Lucy, was the disastrous First Arakan campaign. And historians have called it the most mismanaged campaign of the whole Second World War. Due to the lack of equipment and personnel, the original plan was pared down to a divisional attack on the Arakan Peninsula. British and Indian troops came up against Japanese defensive bunkers for the first time, to which they had no answer. The ensuing Japanese counterattack took less than a month, pushing back numerically superior British and Indian troops into demoralizing confusion. The First Arakan was an utter disaster undertaken by partially trained and demoralized troops, as well as untrained reinforcements with an inefficient command structure. Morale was further undermined by the huge numbers of soldiers affected by malaria and disease, and the problems of evacuation of the sick and wounded back to the base hospitals. Furthermore, the military situation was hampered by the Quit India movement of 1942 in response to the failure of the Cripps mission, when the politicians Sir Stafford Cripps led an unsuccessful British mission to India to try and persuade the Indian nationalist politicians to support the war in return for promises of full autonomy after the war. This meant that a large numbers of troops were required to act as aids to civil power. This, in combination with the Bengal famine of 1943-44, which killed an estimated 3 million Indians, meant that much of India was at its lowest ebb during this period. So before becoming Viceroy, Field Marshal Wavell, who was the then Commander-in-Chief India, instigated the Infantry Committee, which David mentioned earlier this morning, sat in the first 2 weeks of June, and this marks the genuine upturn in the development of the British and Indian armies in the war against Japan. And they attributed the defeats down to 10 factors that you can see here. The Arakan campaign had shown how dire the situation had become. The infantry committee's proposed solution was a thorough basic training of recruits followed by a period of jungle warfare training, again, which David mentioned. Training divisions were established to teach jungle warfare, and recruits would undergo 2 months training with them. Other recommendations including the end of milking. Milking is when non-commissioned officers and officers were taken from one unit to bolster newly raised units. And this is going on right up until 43. One of the big things in 1943 is that the expansion of the army stops. And then so it lets the army actually concentrate on such things as jungle warfare doctrine, training, that kind of thing. Also, other recommendations: increasing the pay of infantry, improve the quality of officers and NCOs, as well as improving the reinforcement system. Most importantly was the need for jungle warfare doctrine, which David showed this picture earlier. As he said, is actually an example is on display upstairs. I mean, very unusual for a training pamphlet to be used in an exhibition, but I think it's vital to the development of the Indian Army. And I quote from the manual, you know, in principle, there's nothing new in jungle warfare, but the environment of the jungle is new to many of our troops. Special training is therefore necessary to accustom them to jungle conditions and teach them jungle methods. And also has a new format, so it includes cartoons and photographs and that kind of thing for the first time. Again, that hasn't happened in training pamphlets prior to this. Includes lessons from previous editions of the training pamphlet, MTP number 9, but also the lessons from the Australian and American experience in the Southwest Pacific. And it forms the basis for all jungle fighting for the remainder of the war. The Indian Army pioneers jungle warfare doctrine, and is the basis. The War Office do produce some 2 training pamphlets in late 44, 45 on jungle warfare, and they were for the BLA, the British Liberation Army, after they defeated the German army in Northwest Europe, with the indication that they'll be going out to Southeast Asia. And the soldiers nicknamed BLA as Burma looms ahead. A change of leadership was essential after the fall of Singapore, the retreat of Burma, and the first battle Arakan. Slim, I think, again, as been mentioned earlier, was a corps commander at a very late stage in both the retreat and also the first Arakan. But he was appointed too late to make a difference in those campaigns. Slim and Savory had both commanded brigades in East Africa and the Middle East. Savory had also commanded a brigade in North Africa, and Savory commanded 23rd Indian Division in Assam from 1942 to 43. So significantly, Field Marshal Wavell was appointed Viceroy of India, and he was replaced by General Claude Auchinleck, as David mentioned earlier this morning. And this battle dress blouse is on display in Beyond Burma. So operational control for the campaigns was now to be conducted by the newly appointed Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia, Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. Auchinleck was responsible for not only making sure India was geared towards jungle warfare in Burma, but also improved the lot of both Indian officers and soldiers, not least by improving pay and conditions. As previously mentioned, he'd never agreed with Indianization, and in his second stint as Commander-in-Chief India, he made sure that the pay of Indian officers were brought up to the level of British officers, which hitherto had not been the case throughout the 1930s and even at the beginning of the war. And again, David talked about his big influence in recruiting across India, and the number of Indian officers goes from, as David mentioned, is around about 400 in 1939. It's over 15,000 in 1945. A change in frontline leadership was also made, and coming back to General Bill Slim, mentioned a number of times today, and you see Slim here alongside the badge of the 14th Army Formation Badge. And this was actually designed by Slim himself. It did actually go to open competition, but funnily enough, Slim won. So red and black are for the colours of the British and Indian armies. The swords pointing downwards against heraldic tradition, because he knew Burma would have to be conquered from the north. 14 for 14th Army, and S on the hilt of this sword was for Slim. Under Slim's leadership, the 14th Army defeated the Imperial Japanese in the army for the first time during the Second Arakan Campaign, which opened on the 4th of February 1944. So a Japanese brigade-sized force penetrated a gap in 7th Indian Division's front. So frontages in Burma were so big and the vegetation so dense, there was always gaps to be exploited. The Japanese force overran and dispersed 7th Indian Division's headquarters and headed for the supply depots in Zwaya, which supported the 7th and the other frontline division, the 5th Indian Division. So for 2 years, this had been the formula for a Japanese victory and an Indian Army debacle. Both 5th and 7th Indian Divisions had now very experienced commanders, Harold Briggs and Frank Messervy. Harold Briggs had commanded 5th Indian Division in North Africa, the Middle East, brings the division back to India and they retrained for jungle warfare. His medal group is also on display in the exhibition upstairs, and he also, after the war, he commands. I think he's one of the longest-serving divisional commanders. He is awarded a DSO in 2 bars, which is quite incredible. And then after the war, he's actually in command of Burma Command up until independence. Frank Messervy, similarly, he commands brigades and divisions in East and North Africa, and then is appointed as divisional commander of 7th Indian Division. Messervy goes on to become a corps commander. We've got a badge of his 7th Indian Divisions on display upstairs, and also after the war, he's in charge of Malaya Command in 1946, and there's a car pennant of his on display upstairs. And interestingly, Messervy becomes the first commander-in-chief of the Pakistan Army from 1947 to 1948. So back to the paper. Even more importantly, they had the 2 divisions had months to absorb the new training and doctrine of 14th Army. Briggs immediately sent Brigadier Geoffrey Evans, to organise the defence of the supply dump. And Evans quickly improvised a force of miscellaneous infantry and rear area troops backed by some gunners and 2 squadrons of tanks in what became known as the admin box. Messervy reached the box and used the armoured unit's radios to reassume command of 7th Indian Division. And the Japanese hurled themselves at the box where they were stopped cold. So when Slim assumed command of 14th Army, he'd made it policy that any unit cut off by Japanese encircling tactics was not to retreat, but to stand fast. Sustained by air supply, they would form an anvil against which the Japanese could be crushed. And the Arakan battle played out to Slim's design. Evans's scratch force held their perimeter. And the Japanese discovered they were up against what became one of the most vital weapons in the 14th Army arsenal, namely the American-built Douglas DC-3, known to the British as the Dakota, that David mentioned this morning. Air supply was an idea that went back to almost the birth of air power. Slim had worked on it when he was a staff officer at Army headquarters, almost a decade before, for the Northwest Frontier. And Ord Wingate's Chindit's air-supported raid had helped refine techniques. So over the next 5 weeks, the Dakotas showered 714 tons of everything from ammunition to razor blades. Slim brought up his reserves to crush the Japanese on the anvil of the 5th and 7th Indian Divisions. And the Japanese attacking force lost 5,000 of its 8,000 men. For the first time, the Indian Army had won a clear-cut victory over the Imperial Japanese Army in the jungle and would never lose again. The main Japanese attack, Operation Yugo, was in the spring of 1944. The prime objective was the speedy capture of Imphal by the Japanese 15th Army, commanded by General Renya Mutaguchi, to forestall the imminent Allied invasion of Burma. And once again, a successful defence was fought, which relied on air supply. The British and Indian armies inflicted a crushing defeat on the Imperial Japanese Army, with they had over 53,000 casualties. Their overall strength had just been just over 44,000, in contrast to the 16,700 casualties in the 14th Army. I'll skip a bit, actually. So lastly, I'll look at the little-known role of... this is about the Arakan. I'll let you read that. Lastly, I'll look at the little-known role of Major General Reginald Savory. His papers have been in the museum here since 1976, and I think they're just incredible. So not only do they have all the official papers that you quite often get in a lot of people's papers, but they're also the letters to his parents, to his wife, and it gives you an idea of what he's actually thinking. And so that's my main section in the book. Savory takes over as Inspector of Infantry alongside a new Inspector of Training Centres and a new Director of Military Training in mid-1943 in part of this overhaul at GHQ India. These changes were to improve the standard of training throughout India. Savory is a real innovator, and he's not the only one. Tukas and a number of the divisional commanders also are. And they really developed the army as battalion commanders in the 30s from then on. And as Inspector of Infantry, and I quote from one of his letters to Ray Callahan, I spent most of my time not only visiting the training establishments, but also infantry units throughout India. I also made regular trips to the front so as to acquaint myself with conditions at the time and apply the lessons learnt. And this is a picture of Savory as Director of Infantry. And this is one of his notebooks. And I think I'm probably one of the few historians who've actually gone through all his material in detail. So he often gets mentioned, but because he's never really in command, not that much has been written about him. And strangely enough, the most has been written about Savory is his First World War service with the 14 Sikhs. So within a few months, Savory became Director of Infantry in late 1943 with his own small directorate. So he's separate from the Military Training Directorate. He produces his own training pamphlets. He does infantry liaison letters. He makes a massive difference for infantry training across India. And with this new remit, he includes infantry organisation, equipment and arms. He made sure that all infantry establishments across India were training along the same lines of the new jungle warfare doctrine. Not only that, but the feedback loop from operations meant that lessons were being continually learnt from the battlefield experience, meaning that the Indian Army had become a learning institution. As with doctrine, equipment was adapted for jungle warfare. So, for example, the range of a 3-inch mortar Mark IV, again, one of these is on display upstairs, was an essential, the 3-inch mortar was an essential support weapon in the close confines of jungle warfare. And it was adapted for jungle warfare. So the base plate was strengthened and the sight was modified, which increased the range from 1,600 to 2,500 yards. And by March 1944, these new base plates had been issued to all units in the 14th Army. And indeed, in the West African divisions, whole mortar regiments were formed. There was a Mark V, but only 5,000 of those are in service by 1945. And by 1944, the theatre generally was much better supplied. So, for example, wireless sets, there's an example upstairs in Beyond Burma, had increased from just under 9,000 in September 1943 to almost 22,000 in April 1944. So thus in 1944, the Indian Army was trained and equipped for jungle warfare to fight the jungle, the disease, and the Japanese. So just to finish off, the appointments of Savory, Auchinleck, and Slim has been seen by the historian and my co-author Ray Callahan as instrumental in the eventual defeat of the Japanese. And I quote, "It helped, of course, that the key figures in Indian military affairs were for the first time in the war all drawn from the Indian Army, and thus understood the traditions and ways of the Indian Army. Thus, by 1945, the Indian Army had become a learning institution, which learned lessons both top-down and bottom-up, and across the whole organisation. And to quote Savory one last time, it was about the adaptation of lessons up down and sideways. In conclusion, during the Second World War, the Indian Army had been, again, repeating what David said, had been transformed from an imperial policing force in 1939 to a modern professional army in 1945 that was thoroughly trained to deal with any tactical situation, whether it was the jungle or the open plains of Burma. After the war, Auchinleck remained as Commander-in-Chief India, with Savory as his Adjutant General, and here you can see the last Indian Army order. Again, this is on display in the Global Gallery upstairs. And I just want to finish off with a blatant plug of my book with Ray. Sadly, it didn't quite make it in time today, but it is actually available. Thank you very much.